Imagine just a stretch of untouched virgin rainforest.
Right.
Like an island location so incredibly remote that most people, I mean, I certainly have never even heard of it, let alone set foot on it.
Yeah, it's really out there.
And usually, when a country undertakes a massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project, there's a certain level of, commercial fanfare.
Yeah.
They want to attract business.
Oh, absolutely. Ribbon cutting, press releases, all of it.
Exactly. They want the world to see the shiny new highway or the port.
Yeah.
But right now, on an island just 40 nautical miles from one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet, an astonishing $9 billion project is systematically turning rainforest into concrete.
Yeah.
And it is doing so with this really fascinating level of quiet determination.
It is, well, I mean, it's the absolute definition of a geographical masterstroke hiding in plain sight. What we are seeing is not just construction, it's a profound geopolitical pivot.
Welcome to this deep dive. We have been poring over a stack of really fascinating sources for this one. Intelligence briefings, historical naval analyses, 2026 defense budget data, and geopolitical situation reports.
There is a lot to get through.
There is.
Yeah.
And it all centers on India's massive decade-long master plan for maritime dominance. Our focus today is to uncover the underlying strategy driving this huge build-out.
Right.
We're going to try to move beyond the traditional way people think about naval power, which, usually just comes down to a rudimentary ship counting contest.
Exactly. The old who has more boats argument.
Right. And instead, we're going to look at how the global map is literally being redrawn.
Because to truly understand geopolitical power in the 21st century, looking at the raw number of warships a nation possesses, I mean, it really only tells half the story.
Yeah.
The real leverage lies in the physical infrastructure. It's in the deep water ports, the island airstrips, the, massive power plants, and these quiet diplomatic agreements that establish a permanent presence far, far away from the front pages.
And for decades, India built a world-class economy while seemingly just turning its back on the ocean surrounding it. But that era is definitively over.
It is.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with that concrete being poured in the rainforest. The briefings outline something called the Great Nicobar Island Development Project.
Right, the Great Nicobar Project.
We are looking at a roughly $9 billion investment to build this just colossal transshipment terminal. The target capacity is 14.2 million TEUs.
Which is massive.
Right. And for anyone not deeply embedded in global logistics, a TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. Basically, it's those standard rectangular metal shipping containers you see stacked on cargo ships.
Yeah, the colorful boxes.
Exactly. So building a facility to handle over 14 million of those means they are constructing an absolute logistics juggernaut.
And alongside that terminal, they're laying down a military-grade, dual-use airport.
Oh, wow.
Plus a 450-megawatt power plant to sustain the facility and an entirely new township. All of this has a target completion date of 2047.
Which that coincides with the centenary of Indian independence, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
But the sheer scale of the concrete is actually secondary to the geography here. Great Nicobar sits just 40 nautical miles from the Strait of Malacca.
Which is incredibly close. I mean, 40 miles.
It's practically next door in maritime terms. And the Strait of Malacca is essentially the world's jugular vein for trade.
Right.
It's this incredibly narrow funnel between Malaysia and Indonesia. So if a cargo ship is traveling from the manufacturing hubs of East Asia to the massive consumer markets in Europe or the Middle East,
It has to go through there.
it has to squeeze through that tiny passage. We're talking tens of thousands of vessels passing through it every single year.
Building a megaport of this magnitude right next to that specific strait, I mean, it's like setting up a heavily armed toll booth on the busiest commercial highway on Earth.
That's a great way to put it.
You aren't just participating in global trade from that vantage point. You are literally looming over it.
And what's fascinating here is that the Great Nicobar Project is not an isolated endeavor.
Really?
Yeah, it's one single node in a much larger, highly coordinated strategy that spans the entire region, stretching from the coast of Iran all the way down to Mauritius.
Okay.
When mainstream media analyzes maritime security in Asia, they almost always frame India's navy against China's in a pure ship-to-ship comparison. And China already operates over 700 vessels.
Wow. 700.
Making it the world's largest navy by hull count. Plus, they have 3 operational aircraft carriers. So if you look at it through that lens alone, India appears, well, hopelessly outmatched.
Yeah, just doing the math, it doesn't look good.
But that framing misses the actual strategy. India is not currently trying to outbuild China ship for ship. They are building a geographical map of influence to control the board itself.
Okay, looking at the historical analysis in our sources,
Hmm.
there is this striking tension. India is a massive peninsula. The ocean surrounds it on three sides.
Right.
Yet they somehow managed to build the fifth largest economy in the world while essentially leaving their maritime borders unattended for decades. How does a nation with that much coastline just ignore the water?
Well, it stems from a profound historical blind spot, and it was really driven by the realities of the Cold War. Interestingly, this wasn't always the plan.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
back in 1946, an influential Indian historian named K.M. Panikkar explicitly warned that Indian independence would mean very little if the country didn't possess the naval strength to protect its surrounding waters.
So he saw it coming.
He absolutely understood the assignment. But geopolitics intervened. India's strategic focus was violently pulled inland toward its mountainous land borders.
Right, due to the immediate conflicts with Pakistan and China.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Add to that a Soviet-aligned diplomatic posture, which heavily favored land-based military strength, and India simply had no immediate use or budget for blue water oceanic ambition.
So the ocean just sat there, waiting to be claimed. And the wake-up call, according to the situation reports we're looking at, was China's string of pearls. That is a term coined by American analysts back in the mid-2000s, right?
That's the one. It describes a very deliberate pattern of Chinese maritime infrastructure developments that slowly but surely formed a ring around the Indian Ocean.
The sources detail this beautifully. I mean, we see China financing the Chabahar Port in Pakistan.
Which was part of a massive $62 billion economic corridor, by the way.
$62 billion. Unbelievable. And then there is Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which China secured on a 99-year lease after the Sri Lankan government defaulted on the development debt.
Right.
And by 2017, China established its very first overseas military base in Djibouti, right on the Horn of Africa.
And individually, to the casual observer, a project like Hambantota or Gwadar just looks like a standard commercial investment.
Sure.
You know, a country needs a port. China has the capital and the engineering firms to build it. But collectively, they form a highly sophisticated logistics network.
Because you can use them for other things.
Exactly. A commercial port built to accommodate massive cargo ships can very easily be dual-purpose to dock, refuel, and resupply naval destroyers. China essentially built the physical infrastructure required to sustain a permanent naval presence in the very waters that New Delhi had always assumed were its own backyard.
Which is a terrifying realization.
It was this creeping realization that finally forced India to dust off K.M. Panikkar's warning from 1946.
And the countermove was Prime Minister Modi's 2015 Sagar Doctrine, which stands for Security and Growth for All in the Region.
Right.
This policy spawned what geopolitical analysts unofficially call the Necklace of Diamonds strategy. It's essentially India's countermap.
That's a good way to put it.
The sources list a series of strategic access points: Chabahar in Iran, Duke in Oman, Sabang in Indonesia, Agalega in Mauritius, and of course, heavily fortifying their own Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
So China built a string of pearls. India is trying to clasp a necklace of diamonds around it.
Right. And the underlying logic of this countermap seems incredibly sound, but the briefings point out it isn't novel.
No, not at all. The idea of prioritizing control over geographic choke points, rather than just sailing massive armadas around the open ocean, is borrowed directly from the playbook of the British Empire.
The sources make a direct comparison there. Can you explain that historical connection? Because they list specific dates that seem crucial to understanding how this whole concept actually functions.
Absolutely. The British understood that the ocean is vast, but the routes to cross it efficiently are actually very narrow.
Okay.
So they built a chain of imperial fortresses at these specific bottlenecks. They secured Gibraltar in 1704, which controlled access to the Mediterranean.
Right.
They took Malta in 1800, securing the center of that sea. Aden was taken in 1839 to control the entrance to the Red Sea, and the Singapore naval base was heavily fortified by 1938 to control the gateway to the Pacific.
So they didn't need to control millions of square miles of open water. They just controlled the doorways.
Which gave the Royal Navy absolute uncontested command of the global sea lanes for roughly a century and a half. Controlling the choke points meant controlling the speed and flow of the world's wealth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the historical analysis also points out a massive fatal flaw in that strategy, the ghost of Singapore.
Yes. February 1942.
Right.
That heavily fortified, state-of-the-art naval base in Singapore fell to the Japanese military in a matter of days. The collapse was stunning.
Days. That's it.
Just days. The British had poured immense resources into building this incredible, supposedly impregnable fortress. But when the crisis actually hit, they lacked the massive two-ocean navy required to actually sail out and defend the facility.
It's like building a multi-billion-dollar smart highway, with the best technology in the world, but completely forgetting to buy any cars to drive on it.
Or like building a massive bank vault, but forgetting to hire security guards.
Exactly. If you can't patrol the perimeter, the vault is useless.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, infrastructure without deployable kinetic force is just a stage set.
Yeah.
It might look intimidating, but it is not a complete strategy. And this historical cautionary tale is the exact tension running underneath India's massive maritime build-out today.
Right, because the grand question is whether India is actually building the fleet to defend their new necklace of diamonds, or if they're unwittingly setting themselves up to repeat Britain's 1942 mistake on a much larger scale.
Exactly.
So let's dive into the resource gap then, because the defense budget data in our stack has some serious warning lights flashing.
It really does.
On paper, India's ambition matches the scale of their new map. They have a 15-year roadmap designed to field roughly 230 vessels by 2037.
Which is a huge leap.
Huge! There is talk of fielding 4 aircraft carriers, including one that is nuclear-powered, and developing 10 new nuclear propulsion systems. And their near-term target is to reach over 200 warships by 2035, climbing from about 150 today.
Expanding the fleet by 50 advanced warships in a single decade is a monumental industrial undertaking.
Yeah.
And you mentioned nuclear propulsion. That is a massive technological leap.
Because it changes how the subs operate, right?
Completely. A conventional submarine has to surface, or at least run a snorkel, to run its diesel engines and recharge its batteries. In modern warfare, the moment a submarine surfaces, it is detected and vulnerable.
Right.
A nuclear-powered submarine generates its own power internally. It can stay submerged, fast, and completely stealthy for as long as the crew has food to eat. It completely changes the arithmetic of naval deterrence.
But I have to push back here, because the budget data from the 2026-27 fiscal year genuinely threw me.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
The briefings show that India is actively trying to counter a Chinese Navy whose newest aircraft carrier, the Fujian, just reached full combat capability this year.
Yes.
Now, India's overall defense allocation did grow by a very healthy 15%, reaching about $87 billion.
Right.
But the Indian Navy's capital allocation, the actual money meant for buying and building these new ships, grew by only 3%. Meanwhile, the Air Force's capital allocation shot up by 31%. How do you build a massive maritime map while seemingly starving the Navy's capital growth to fund the Air Force?
The contradiction you noticed is the defining vulnerability of this entire master plan.
It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it's a classic symptom of scale-chasing urgency. India is trying to modernize its land forces, its air force, and its navy simultaneously, and the budget is simply tearing at the seams. And the bottleneck isn't just financial, it's profoundly industrial. India currently ranks around 20th globally in commercial shipbuilding capacity.
20th.
They hold less than 1% of the global market share. The infrastructure to rapidly pump out steel hulls just isn't there.
Wait, who controls the lion's share of that market then?
China, South Korea, and Japan control roughly 90% of global shipbuilding.
Wow, 90%. And the briefings also know that India's flagship port development program, the Sagarmala program, which is meant to be the backbone of their domestic maritime infrastructure, actually saw its budget slashed by 29% this year.
Which means that slow-growing capital budget, combined with a very limited domestic industrial base, runs the very real risk of causing those 2037 and 2047 fleet targets to slip entirely.
Yeah.
A nation cannot just decree a blue water navy into existence through policy papers. You have to weld it together ship by ship in shipyards that require massive sustained capital investment over decades.
So what does this all mean? If the budget is stretched this incredibly thin, we really need to look at how the individual nodes of this necklace of diamonds are holding up under the pressure.
Definitely.
The situation reports paint a picture of some very quiet strategic victories mixed with some glaring vulnerabilities. Let's look at the successes first.
Okay.
The developments on Agalega Island in Mauritius stand out.
Oh, for sure. Over the last decade, utilizing roughly $90 million in funding, India built a 3,000-meter airstrip and a deep-sea jetty on Agalega.
Which is pretty far out there.
Very far. The geography here is vital. It allows India to host their P-8I submarine hunting planes far out in the western Indian Ocean.
Okay.
These aircraft can patrol massive swaths of water, tracking the acoustic signatures of foreign submarines long before they get anywhere near the Indian coast.
And they are also supplementing that with drones. The reports say they leased 2 additional MQ-9B Sea Guardian drones in August 2026, bringing their leased fleet to 4.
Right.
These drones are essentially unblinking eyes in the sky. They provide persistent maritime domain awareness, just scanning the ocean for unusual surface activity without risking a pilot.
And strategically, closer to home, they opened a new, highly advanced submarine base called INS Varsha on their eastern coast at Rambilli.
Oh, right.
Submarines require deep water close to shore to dive quickly and avoid detection when leaving port. Rambilli provides this geography perfectly. It is positioned specifically as a strategic counterweight to China's massive underground submarine base on Hainan Island.
And they're locking in these physical assets with diplomatic maneuverability, too.
Yes.
In May 2026, India signed a new maritime surveillance sharing pact with the Quad, bringing together Australia, Japan, and the United States. And for the first time in 16 years, they are chairing the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium.
But we also have to look at the fractures in the network.
Right.
Chabahar Port in Iran is supposed to be the foundational Western anchor of this entire basing strategy. India poured $120 million of direct investment into building it.
Which is not small change.
Not at all. But in April 2026, the port lost its U.S. sanctions waiver.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The report suggests India might be forced to hand over its operating stake entirely to an Iranian entity just to avoid secondary sanctions.
This raises an important question. If the Western anchor falls apart, does the whole necklace of diamonds break? Or is it just a minor setback?
Well, this raises an important question about the structural integrity of the entire master plan. If the Western anchor is neutralized not by enemy warships, but by a stroke of a pen on a sanctions document,
Right.
it forces us to ask, is this necklace of diamonds a coherent, mutually reinforcing chain like the British built? Or is it just a loose set of individually vulnerable pearls that can be picked off or politically isolated one by one?
And then there's the domestic fiction. Going back to the Great Nicobar project, turning that virgin rainforest into a military-grade transshipment hub has sparked intense pushback.
Very intense.
The reports detail severe environmental impacts and major concerns regarding the displacement and cultural disruption of the Shompen and Nicobarese indigenous communities who live on the island.
Which is a stark reminder that drawing these massive geopolitical maps always comes with heavy, tangible local costs. A geographically sound strategy on paper still has to survive the realities of domestic politics, environmental regulations, and international diplomacy.
Which brings us directly to why this deeply matters to you, the listener. It is so easy to read about naval strategy, nuclear submarines, and drone deployments, and treat it all as this abstract, distant game of geopolitical chess played by people in uniform.
Yeah, it feels disconnected from daily life.
Exactly. But global supply chains are deeply personal. The sources note a staggering metric. 95% of India's trade by volume and 70% by value moves by sea.
That is the metric that grounds this entire conversation.
Yeah.
When a commercial oil tanker is targeted by drones in the Arabian Sea, or if a critical choke point like the Malacca Strait suddenly becomes a contested military zone, the economic impact does not wait for warships to deploy. It hits immediately.
It makes you wonder what would happen to your daily life if that global shipping highway just stopped.
Yeah.
What stands out to you about how fragile global trade really is?
I mean, global shipping insurance premiums would skyrocket
Yeah.
overnight. The cost of fuel at your local pump would surge. Supply chains for basic electronics, medicine, and food would bottleneck. India is not just building a military force to wave a flag in international waters. They are fundamentally trying to build a fortress around their long-term economic security.
Because if they fail to secure those routes, the economic shockwaves will be felt in every port and every market around the world.
Exactly.
The intelligence briefings lay out 3 projected scenarios for how this incredibly tense dynamic plays out over the next few years. The first and most likely scenario is incremental progress.
Right, a slow build.
Yeah. That Great Nicobar port phase slowly comes online, overcoming the domestic pushback. The naval fleet grows steadily into the low 200s. But because of the budget constraints, they don't fully close the raw size gap with China's existing fleet.
And the second scenario outlined is the slower path. This is where those glaring capacity bottlenecks, we discussed the lack of domestic shipyards, and that meager 3% capital budget growth caused major operational delays.
The targets just keep slipping.
Right. The grand targets for 2037 slip further and further into the future, leaving the newly built ports vulnerable and underdefended.
And the worst-case scenario is outright node failure. This is where the Chabahar Port is lost entirely to sanctions. Meanwhile, China capitalizes on the delay and deepens its access near sensitive Indian assets.
Effectively breaking the necklace of diamonds before India can even fully clasp it together.
Wow.
All three scenarios hinge on a brutal race against time, industrial capacity, and diplomatic stamina.
We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing the mechanics of choke points. We've mapped out the physical infrastructure of the necklace of diamonds versus the string of pearls. We've looked closely at the concrete pouring into Galathea Bay. But there's a final piece of geopolitical analysis in our stack that flips this entire conversation on its head.
There is, and it's fascinating.
What if that massive physical map of ports and bases is already becoming obsolete?
It's a vital pivot to consider. Recent analysis suggests that China is already evolving beyond just building physical deep water ports. Yeah, they recognize the friction those projects cause. Instead, they are now actively cultivating surrounding nations, places like the Maldives and Bangladesh, as political swing states. Through targeted investments and diplomatic leverage, they are attempting to secure a purely ideological and political anti-India arc across the entire region.
So they don't even need the port if they have the politicians.
Exactly. If China can essentially win the political allegiance of the governments bordering these critical routes, physical military control of the choke points might not even matter anymore. An ideological map can override a physical one.
Wow. That completely changes the board. If the surrounding nations shift their political allegiance, all that concrete pouring into the rainforest might just lose its strategic value entirely.
It's definitely something to watch.
It is definitely something for all of us to mull over the next time we look at a map of the Indian Ocean. Because 40 nautical miles from the Malacca Strait, the rainforest is still being cleared, the concrete is still being toured, and the economic map of the 21st century is being drawn in real time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.